Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marcus Whitehurst, Interim Vice Provost for Educational Equity. I'm delighted to welcome you to our annual Best Practices in Diversity Workshop. This year, we are honored to have Dr. Derald Wing Sue, a professor of psychology from Columbia University, join us for a discussion on microaggressions and marginality. Our theme for today is reducing stereotyping, microaggressions, stereotype threat, and other inequities in order to improve our diversity climate and to promote collaboration and success. As we achieve more demographic diversity at Penn State, our work will be just beginning, and inclusion and equity will continue to be our focus for faculty, staff, and students. Today's presentation was one of Dr. Terrell Jones' last initiatives, and I'd like to acknowledge the passing of our friend and colleague and encourage everyone to attend his memorial service scheduled for next Tuesday, September 23rd at 4 p.m. in the Pasquarella Spiritual Center. I want to personally thank all of our co-sponsors, the Forum on Black Affairs, the Council of College Multicultural Leadership within the Colleges of Education, Health and Human Development, Information Science and Technology, Business, Liberal Arts, Agricultural Sciences, Earth and Mineral Sciences, and the Graduate School. Also would like to thank our commissions, the Commission for Women, Commission on Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Equity, and the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Diversity, the Department of Psychology and the Bridge Diversity Alliance, the Paul Robeson Cultural Center, the Presidential Leadership Academy, the Schreier's Honors College, the Schreier Institute for Technology, Teaching Excellence, University Libraries Diversity Committee, and the Office of Global Programs. I also want to thank Eileen Williams and Victoria Sanchez for taking the lead in organizing the logistics for today's presentation, and later Victoria will moderate our Q&A discussion. In addition to our audience here at the Conference Center, we have participants in 16 of our Penn State campus locations via Polycom. And I'll ask each of those locations to please mute your microphones. Our campus representatives are from Abington, Altoona, Beaver, Berks, Brandywine, Dickinson School of Law, Du Bois, Erie, Fayette, Harrisburg, Hershey Medical Center, Mont Alto, New Kensington, Schuylkill, Shenango, Worthington, Scranton, and York. Our presentation today is being recorded, and the information on its availability will be announced later. And I encourage you to check our Educational Equity website under Best Practices for updated information. Since 2005, our office has worked diligently to bring these types of thought-provoking best practice workshops to the university in hopes to keep us up to date and well informed about relevant topics in diversity, as well as strategic planning. Immediately following this workshop, I invite everyone to attend our annual joint reception of our senior faculty mentor and the Forum on Black Affairs. It will be located over in the Senate Suite. And the reception will be focused on inviting and welcoming new and returning diverse faculty to Penn State. And again, everyone is welcome to attend. And finally, to formally introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jose Soto is an associate professor in the clinical psychology program here at Penn State. He has been a fierce advocate for diversity, social justice, and inclusion through his teaching, service, and research, all of which focus on developing and advancing knowledge that is informed by diversity. His research in particular examines the intersections of culture, health, and emotion with an emphasis on the study of ethnic minority culture and those experiences associated with ethnic minority status, for example, discrimination and oppression. He is the 2012 recipient of the Charles and Shirley Thomas Award from Division 45 for his contributions to the education and training of students of color, as well as his professional presence within ethnic minority communities. And he is also the recipient of the 2014 James Robinson Equal Opportunity Award for commitment and leadership around issues of diversity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jose Soto.
Thank you, Marcus. Anybody who has seen me around frequently knows the magnitude of the situation by my attire. This is not regular attire, but for Dr. Sue, I went all out. Good afternoon, everyone. Today is my sincere pleasure and honor to introduce our esteemed speaker, Dr. Derald Wing Sue. This is no small task, given the many accomplishments and distinctions earned by Dr. Sue over what has been a truly impressive career. But I will do my best to provide you with a glimpse of the many contributions that have made him a leader within the field of psychology. Dr. Sue is professor of psychology and education in the Department of Counseling and Clinical Psychology at Teachers College in the School of Social Work at Columbia University. He received his PhD from the University of Oregon, from which he has received the Outstanding Alumni Award, and as I read on, you will quickly understand why. Dr. Sue can truly be described as a pioneer in the field of multicultural psychology, multicultural education, multicultural counseling and therapy, and the psychology of racism and anti-racism. He has done extensive multicultural research and writing in psychology and education long before the academic community perceived it favorably, and his theories and concepts have paved the way for a generation of younger scholars, such as myself and others in this room, to pursue work in minority mental health and multicultural psychology. Dr. Sue was co-founder and first president of the Asian American Psychological Association, past president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race, also known as Division 45 of the APA, and past president of the Society of Counseling Psychology, Division 17 of the APA. He is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, and the American Association of Applied and Preventive Psychology. He has authored 17 books, over 150 publications, and numerous media productions. In all of these endeavors, his commitment to multiculturalism has been obvious, and his contributions have forced the field to seriously question the monocultural knowledge base of its theories and practices. As evidence of his professional impact, Dr. Sue's book, Counseling the Culturally Diverse Theory and Practice, co-authored with his brother David Sue and now in its 6th edition, has been identified as the most frequently cited publication in the multicultural field. Dr. Sue has played a leadership role, along with other colleagues, in laying the foundations of the cultural competency movement in the delivery of mental health services to an increasingly diverse population. Because of a personal life-changing experience with racism directed toward his family, Dr. Sue's research direction has progressively turned to the psychology of racism and anti-racism. Together with his research team at Teachers College in Columbia, he has been studying the causes, manifestations, and impact of racial microaggressions. Their groundbreaking work resulted in a taxonomy of racial microaggressions that empowers people of color by making the invisible visible, by validating their experiential realities, and by providing them with a language to describe their experiences. Dr. Sue will be sharing some of this work with us today. As recognition of his outstanding contributions, Dr. Sue has been the recipient of numerous awards from professional organizations, including, but not limited to, the Lifetime Achievement Award and the Mentoring and Leadership Award from the Society of the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race. He is the 2013 recipient of the Public Interest Award from the American Psychological Association, an organization that has also bestowed on him the Presidential Citation for Outstanding Service and the Award for Career Contributions to Education and Training. Not nearly as impressive, but much closer to home, Dr. Sue's name is regularly mentioned in my graduate course on multicultural perspectives in clinical psychology. So far this semester, we have not gone a week without reading something that has been written by him, reading something in which he was cited, or simply mentioning his name to ingratiate ourselves to the multicultural gods. It should come as no surprise by now that Dr. Sue is frequently sought out as a spokesperson on issues of racism, multiculturalism, and diversity by the press and other groups and organizations worldwide. In a 2012 study titled Legends of the Field, Influential Scholars in Multicultural Counseling, Dr. Sue was identified as the top-cited scholar across multicultural textbooks, and his influence was described as profound. We are delighted to have someone of his stature here, and on behalf of the Penn State community, please join me in extending a hearty welcome to Dr. Derald Wing Sue.
Dr. Soto, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay, you still can't hear me? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Can you boost it up? Okay, I think that's much better. Thank you, Dr. Soto, for that introduction. I want you to fly back with me to Philadelphia so you can talk to my wife and tell her these good things. You know, first of all, I'm really thankful and pleased to have the opportunity to share with all of you some of the work that I've been doing on racial, gender, sexual orientation, microaggressions. And what I'd like to point out to you before we get started is that microaggressions are the everyday slights, indignities, put-downs, insults, and invalidations that well-intentioned individuals who are unaware that they are doing so are delivering to certain marginalized groups in our society. But before I get to that, I really want to pay homage to Dr. Maya Angelou. In 2014, I finished the book called Race Talk. That was in May. I finished the book Race Talk, and then I heard the news that she had passed. And it was such a sad event that I have dedicated the book Race Talk, The Conspiracy of Silence to her for several primary reasons. One of them being that she truly represents the trailblazer for many of us in the journey that we undertake. And that it almost seemed ironic that as I was finishing the book and heard the news, that it was almost like she was passing the baton on to many of us who enjoyed and really benefited from her work and told to almost carry on. But besides that, you know, she talked about microaggressions in different language and terms. And what I really want to do, I'm going to be stepping down here, is to read to you certain passages that I feel are very inspirational. And this, many of you are familiar with, comes from the poem that she wrote, Still I Rise. And it goes like, you may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may tread me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. You may shoot me with your words. You may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air I'll rise. Now, Maya Angelou not only was an individual who modeled for us how people of color dealt with microaggressions in a hostile, invalidating society that strikes at the very core of our identity. And one of the things that she writes about, if you read the book, and Now I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, she doesn't use the term microaggressions, but she talks about the fact that these slights, indignities, hateful looks, how we are portrayed in textbooks, to her represent little murders in contrast to what she calls the grand execution. Something that microaggressions talk about, that it is not the overt, racist, the hate-filled crimes that people of color are most fearful of, but the little slights and indignities that come from well-intentioned individuals who experience themselves as good moral individuals. They are the employers who hire, decide who is hired. They are the teachers who educate the children. They are the healthcare providers who determine who to treat and how to care for them. And in some respects, Maya Angelou's work really talks about the issue of microaggressions. Today, what I'm going to be doing is trying to cover a number of topics in a very brief period of time. One of them is, what is the definition of microaggressions, and why are they so hard to define and to recognize? Secondarily, how are they manifested in everyday life? I'm sorry, I've got something stuck in my throat, it seems like. How do you recognize microaggressions when they occur? And this is what makes microaggressions so powerful, because they are subtle, unintentional, oftentimes outside the level of conscious awareness of the individual who is delivering microaggressions. What are the origins of microaggressions? And really the unpleasant reality when you begin to research and think about microaggressions is that they aren't isolated behaviors. You know, you don't go into a work site and have people simply change their behavior to be politically correct. What is so powerful of microaggressions are they are reflections of a worldview of inclusion, exclusion, superiority, inferiority, and so forth. That's why they are so powerful. They are not isolated behaviors. Simply changing the behavior is not enough. You have to get at the core of the worldviews. What is the harmful impact of microaggressions? When we first published the taxonomy of microaggressions in 2007, many of my colleagues wrote to the American psychologists letters saying that I was making a mountain out of a molehill, that microaggressions are benign, trivial, they are no different than the ordinary insults and put-downs that white people experience from insensitive individuals, and that by virtue of talking about the harm impact of microaggressions, I was, in some sense, portraying people of color as weak and vulnerable. In essence, we found directly the opposite, that with the language of microaggressions, it empowered people of color because they gave them a language to describe something that we knew was happening all the time, and that indeed we weren't crazy, and that it helped in this way. The dynamics of microaggressions, aren't people of color, women, and other marginalized groups simply oversensitive? This is going to, microaggressions present a dilemma for people of color, for other socially devalued groups when you want to raise it, because we then get accused by individuals who deliver microaggressions as being paranoid, oversensitive, making something bigger than it really is. And we'll talk about this very shortly. Becoming a culturally competent leader really begins to ask the question of how do we change? How do we overcome microaggressions? And this has to, I will have no time to deal with it, but this has to occur at the individual, institutional, and societal levels. I'm going to focus primarily in talking about interpersonal, individual microaggressions, but Penn State is no different from other institutions in which the policies, practices, programs can be delivering microaggressions in an environmental way by virtue of institutional microaggressions, and that microaggressions only occur because they are framed within a societal context of perception, and we can talk about that as well. What I'd like to do is give you really 3 examples of microaggressions. Some of you are smiling because you already know what I'm going to say, that it is not unusual in my day-to-day experience for people to compliment me for speaking good English. Cab drivers do it when I visit a city. Other individuals who hear me speak, if I don't mention this, will come up to me and say, your English is really outstanding. You speak very well, good English. Now, I'll come back to that. The second thing that often happens to me, and I think a lot of my Latino brothers and sisters, is to, in some sense, be asked this simple question: where were you born? And when I say, oh, I was born in Portland, Oregon, they will say to me, no, 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 where were you born? And I respond by saying, Portland, Oregon? I'm beginning to doubt. Then they will follow up and say, no, no, what country were you born in? And I'll say the United States, and they get very embarrassed. Now, think about this. Both the example of you speak good English, where were you born, are being delivered by nice folks. I mean, they aren't mean, evil individuals, right? They in their conscious mind, they are showing interest in me or complimenting me. But what they don't realize is this is the power of microaggressions. They have a meta-communication, a hidden communication. And that hidden communication delivered to me as an Asian American is that I am a perpetual foreigner in my own country. I am an alien. True Americans look and act the following way. But you as an Asian, as a Latino or Latina, you are not true Americans. That's the message that I have gotten throughout my life, the moment of grade school until now. I mean, in grade school, went even further. When we studied Western civilization, they would always talk about the building of the West, the civilization. There was almost an absence about the Asian American contribution to the building of the transcontinental railroad, the mining of gold, the agricultural discoveries by the Japanese. That was absent. And as a student of color, I almost always felt that there was a part of me missing. I could relate to a lot of the history, but something was missing. And the irony was this: the only time the teacher would talk about Asians was when we studied a unit of Asia in China or Japan. And the teacher would turn to me and say, Derald, when you people celebrate this holiday, what do you do? And I would say, I don't know. I mean, should I know? But here the perception is that Asians are not true Americans, they're foreigners. That perception continues to exist in the mindset of many individuals. Campus climate also. Daniel Salazano at UCLA has done a number of studies of the hostile, invalidating, microaggressive climate at UCLA towards students of color, primarily African American and Latino students, in talking about this. And I became very aware of this when several years ago, I was asked by Harvard University to do training they were having a one-week event called Making Harvard a More Welcoming Environment for Students and Faculty of Color. That was they had special videos, celebratory events throughout the entire week. My role was to talk to all the deans of Harvard about making Harvard this much more welcoming environment. And I recall that as I was standing in front of all the deans, I scanned the room as I was being introduced, and I noted that the majority of the color of the audience was white. It was primarily white men. There were some white women who were associate deans, but they were all white. And it was ironic. I made that observation. I said that as I stand before you today, unless I'm wrong, all of you are white. And there was this uncomfortable shifting around that was going on. And I said to them, do you know the message it is sending to a prospective student or faculty of color? If you're trying to recruit a faculty of color, there are 3 messages coming, whether you intend it or not. One of them is that you will not be comfortable here. 2, you are not welcome here. 3, if you choose to stay here, there is only so far up at Harvard. You may not graduate as a student of color. You may not get promoted or tenured. That's a hidden communication that is occurring, whether you mean that or not. After that presentation, one of the, I remember this, one of the deans came up to me and said that, Professor Sue, you know, Harvard does all its new faculty orientation in, I don't know what, it's Harvard room or and he made the observation that in this room when we talk proudly about Harvard and we're doing the orientation, there are full-scale pictures of every past president and the current one of Harvard University. And you know, after Larry Summers resigned, we now have a female president, but all of them were men. And his question was, do you think it would make faculty of color uncomfortable? And I said, what do you think? That precisely is the issue here, that microaggressions can be verbal, can be nonverbal, or can be environmental, that is being delivered here. I want to read to you an important thing for you to consider, because we're talking now about the impact of microaggressions. And this comes from an African-American participant. It gets so tiring, you know. It sucks you dry. People don't trust you. From the moment I wake up, I know stepping out the door that it will be the same day after day. The bus can be packed, but no one will sit next to you. I guess it may be a good thing because you always get more room. No one crowds you. You get served last. When they serve you, they have this phony smile and just want to get rid of you. You have to show more ID to cash a check. You turn on the TV and there you always see someone like you being handcuffed and jailed. They look like you, and sometimes you begin to think it is you. You are a plague. You try to hold it in, but sometimes you lose it. Explaining doesn't help. They don't want to hear. Even when they ask, quote, why do you have a chip on your shoulder, end quote, shit, I just walk away now. It doesn't do any good explaining. You know, and these are, you know, is this an exaggeration? Not to him who talks about the reality here, and there are questions that really get to the heart of our study and research on microaggressions. Is life as hard as this black man describes? Is he exaggerating or misreading the actions of others? Is he oversensitive or paranoid? Is he right in concluding that others don't want to listen to his explanations? Why is he so angry and resentful? Do you believe him or not? If not, what are your reasons? This is really at the basis of what we talk about, the harmful impact of a lifetime of cumulative microaggressions. Now, the colleagues who wrote to me and said I was building a mountain out of a molehill and that I was exaggerating the impact of microaggressions don't realize that people of color, women, LGBTQ individuals experience microaggressions from the time they are born and experience it continually. It is not in isolation. That's why a lot of times a microaggression occurs to me, it's the straw that breaks the camel's back, and I react. And it may, to the person who delivered unintentionally microaggression, seems that is out of proportion, but that person has not seen the history of one after another of microaggressions that has occurred to me. The issue here. So that's one of the things I want you to begin to think about, that this forms the psyche and the impact of microaggressions. Here's another thing that many people of color can relate to, and this comes from an award-winning journalist, Thomas Lee, who won many awards for his work. I went to Fridley to interview the president of a large manufacturing company. I arrived a few minutes before noon and told the receptionist at the front desk that I was looking for the president's executive assistant. Quote, "Oh, are you delivering food?" End quote, she asked. It wasn't the first time I was mistaken for a Chinese food delivery guy. In college, I had arrived at my girlfriend's dorm with dinner, and the front desk dude assumed just that. I was embarrassed, to be sure, but let it go. That's the burden of being a Chinese American with a penchant for baseball caps, jeans, and takeout foods. Yet the receptionist's inquiry stunned me. I was wearing a dress shirt, black slacks, and black dress shoes. True, I was sporting a backpack and sunglasses, but how many food delivery guys whip out Kung Pao chicken from a Gap bag? After realizing her error, the receptionist offered a rather clumsy explanation. I only asked because the executive assistant always orders food, she said. Nice try, lady. At least she didn't speak extra slowly and offer a tip. Now, these are questions that we have to ask about these, because these are prime examples of microaggressions that people of color experience day in and day out. Have you ever mistaken a person of color for a service worker? Or as a white person, have you ever been mistaken for a service worker? What were your reactions? How did you handle the situation? Did you make up an excuse? Were you offended? Why is it such a big deal? Is there a difference between being mistaken for a service worker as a white person or as a person of color? What are the differences? These are all questions that we don't have time to deal with, but they strike at the heart of many of the concepts of microaggressions. What is the difference? Really talks about one of power, influence, and so forth. Now, microaggressions also occur very much. Remember after the George Zimmerman verdict came out, when he was declared not guilty, this was one of the few times that Barack Obama was so affected. He held an impromptu press conference, as many of you might recall, and it was not scripted, but obviously he had thought about this. And he came out and said that there are very few black men, including me, who haven't walked across the street and heard the car door locks. There are very few black men, including me, who haven't been monitored more closely and followed in stores for fear I was going to, steal from the store. There are very few white women in elevators who won't tense up and clutch their purse when you walk in as a black man, and then when you walk out, this relief that seems to flood over them when you leave. Here is where it is microaggressions are being delivered. These are nonverbal microaggressions. Clutching your purse or checking your wallet when you're around people of color. Locking car doors. These are nonverbal manifestations of a belief that you have that black men are violent, up to no good, and so forth. We see this in Ferguson, Missouri. The possibility, we saw this in terms of George Zimmerman, in terms of his his profiling of Trayvon Martin. And, you know, microaggressions may seem small, banal, and trivial, but in the case of Trayvon Martin, it had a macro impact. It resulted in his death. Microaggressions result in a lot of the inequities that we see in education, employment, and healthcare that we will refer to later here. Microaggressions, if you define them, are brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities. They may be intentional or unintentional, but they communicate a hostile, derogatory, negative, slight, or invalidation to marginalized groups in our society. Microaggressions are subtle. They oftentimes are stunning. They, you know, oftentimes I'm surprised. I'm with, you know, and the surprise that I encounter comes most from people I know who deliver a microaggression, and they are stunning, quick, and by the time I think about how to respond to it, it's over. That's one of the things that we can talk, but they come through subtle insults delivered through nonverbal means that are automatic in terms of their impact here. Microaggressions are brief, they are everyday exchanges. In the classroom, students of color, for example, describe microaggressions as a pattern of being overlooked, under-respected, and devalued because of their race. You know, when microaggressions occur, they present a charged racial situation if we're talking about education in the classroom. I'm reviewing a major study now. I don't know the authors. It's called Toxic Rain, Microaggressions in the Classroom, in which they did 60 observations in 3 community colleges. It's the first time that community colleges were explored. And what they found was that microaggressions during these actual incidents that were being observed occurred most commonly from well-intentioned professors. Teachers were the largest individuals delivering microaggressions. And this is something that occurs here, and one of the interesting things about it is that we also did 4 major studies that dealt with difficult dialogues on race in the classroom. We studied a group of students of color, white students, white faculty, and a faculty of color separately. And then we brought them together to look at commonalities and differences. One of the things that we discovered quite quickly was that students of color and faculty of color could easily identify a microaggression that created tension and a difficult dialogue in the classroom. White students and white faculty had great difficulty putting their fingers on it. They could tell something was wrong, but they didn't know why, the anxiety, the tension, what was going on in the classroom. And one of the things that we surmised from that study was that if you are unaware of what microaggressions are, you can't facilitate a discussion or something that is positive related to this. So that's one of the primary things that we find, the invisibility, the frequency that it is delivered in college classrooms at both 4-year graduate and 2-year community colleges. And I would imagine that if studies begin to be conducted in pre-K through 12, they are manifested differently, but you're going to find that this occurs very frequently as well. Here are some examples of microaggression, racial microaggressions. A black student is complimented by the professor as being articulate and bright. Now, why is that a microaggression? I mean, many of you remember when Joe Biden made an announcement that he was running for the Democratic presidential nomination, and Barack Obama had, there were 7 men and 1 black man, 1 white woman that, lined the stage, but they asked Biden about the Barack Obama phenomena. And his statement, meant to be a compliment, was that, well, for the first time, you have a nice-looking, bright, articulate black man who is good-looking and so forth. That's a storybook man. He could not understand why many African Americans were irate and angry with that statement. And that represents a microaggression to the person, Biden, who is a good man in civil rights and human rights, was himself his worldview made it so that he was insulting to Barack Obama and most African Americans, because it's saying that it's such a surprise. You can ask, why is it a microaggression? You ask the question, has there never been a bright, articulate, good-looking African American man? And what he was in essence saying was that Barack Obama is an exception. It allows the person to cling on to the mythology and stereotypes that most black men are inarticulate, not very bright. African American students in many classrooms are very sensitive to what a white professor might be saying or doing, and believing that they're complimenting the individual and not understanding what precisely is going on. This is a second example. Asian American students oftentimes are complimented in classrooms for speaking good English. Gender microaggressions. This comes from the Columbia Medical School. A female resident who is a physician wearing a stethoscope is mistaken by medical students for being a nurse. And in all 3 of these, you have to look at what the hidden communication are saying. Women are not as competent and capable. Their roles are limited to domestic chores and duties. That's the communication that's occurring. Many of you who are aware of the studies about how teachers respond in grade school to female and male students. Remember that? When a teacher asks a question and hands go up, the teacher is more likely to ask the male student. Even female teachers do that. Now, the communication that is unstated is that men know the answers, women are less competent, less capable. And that theme carries through many microaggressions to the current here. Male students in private refer to a female professor who is assertive as a bitch, while their male counterparts are decisive and assertive teachers. This is also played out in the work environment. And this is a no-win situation for women. If indeed they act what is a mask of what describes as it being a forceful leader or boss, they are castigated for it. If you have a white male executive coming before his production team and saying that, I am pissed off with all of you. You have failed to meet the deadline, and the man pounds the table. The reaction by many of the coworkers will be, what a forceful boss this is. I'm glad on his team. Now, if you get a white woman who comes up and does the very same thing, you're likely to say, what a bitch. And if you get a black man, black manager who does the same thing, oh, what an out of control, irrational, impulsive individual this is. These are all moderated in some sense by this sexual orientation microaggressions. You've heard the term, that's so gay. So oftentimes used in grade schools. Things that are deviant or out of place are considered gay. This is one thing that I found. A lesbian client reluctantly discloses her sexual orientation to a straight counselor trainee by stating that she was, quote, into women, end quote. The counselor indicated he is not shocked by the disclosure because he once worked with a client who was, quote, into dogs, end quote. You know, here you have a therapist trying to say, I'm not surprised with it, I'm comfortable in working with this, but he compares it to deviancy, pathology, in terms of the work here. Other socially, you've heard it before. You know, a lot of people will say, don't try to Jew me down, as a statement here. One of the, you know, Richard Keller, who does work on disability microaggressions, gives this example that many of the students with visual impairments or who are blind, Richard is the director of the disability services. He's completely blind, legally blind. And he tells me how when he's introduced, when people come and he's introduced to a new faculty member who is such and such, they'll walk up to him and say, "Good morning, Richard, how are you?" And Richard's response is, "I can hear perfectly well, thank you." You know, it's the indication here is that his blindness or disability affects all aspects of his functioning here. And I want to share with you some of the themes that the faculty of color and women faculty talk about their experiences of a hostile, invalidating campus climate. They experience the campus climate as isolating, alienating, extremely stressful, risky, and invalidating. They are more likely to experience being the only one that leads to feelings of isolation and loneliness. In fact, they talk about this, the higher, and this, in the corporate world as well, the higher you rise, the more isolated and lonely it becomes because fewer and fewer of you are up there. They lack mentors who possess knowledge of the minority experience or the experience of ethnocentrism. They have their research and scholarship devalued and considered illegitimate. They have their racial or gender identities assailed. Derald, why are you always talking about race? When I look at you, I don't see you as Asian American. You're just Derald. You know, they mean that well, but they are unaware that my identity, group identity as an Asian American is very important. And by professing colorblindness, they indeed are violating me in terms of a microaggression. They experience elevated levels of stress and distress. They are subjected to bias promotion and tenure decisions because the criteria used for promotion and tenure are very ethnocentric and bound, are culture bound, class bound in this way. They are more likely to have their credentials questioned by students and colleagues. One professor of color told me that when he started lecturing, one white student that had great difficulty of dealing with an African American professor constantly said, "I can't find that in the textbook. What you're talking about." It's almost like I don't believe you unless it is written in the textbook. One of these, there are 6 basic assumptions that I want to quickly talk about that underlie our ability to understand microaggressions. One of these is that we have all been socialized into a society in which there exists individual, institutional, and societal biases associated with race, culture, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. If you look at the history of the United States, it is the history, if we talk about race, it is a history of racism. That angers many people when I talk about it. How else can you talk about the United States unless you talk about the enslavement of African Americans, the taking away of land from the indigenous people of this country, the incarceration of Japanese Americans. 2/3, by the way, were citizens by virtue of birth in the United States. You can't tell me that these represent simply individual acts of racism, but they were broad governmental actions that supported that. Now, in all fairness and balance, the history of the United States is also the history of anti-racism. There has always been groups and individuals who have fought for equal access and opportunity. But why this is so important is to deny it, the reality of this is to deny the experiential, racialized experience of people of color in the United States. The second assumption that is important is that by virtue of social conditioning, our socialization and cultural conditioning, none of us are immune from inheriting the biases of our ancestors, institutions, and society. None of us are. Each and every one of us here are victims of a socialization process that is full of isms in terms, and it is generally outside the level of our conscious awareness. Besides the master narrative that we are taught about equal access and opportunity, democracy, and equity, there is a counter narrative that we are being taught that some groups are better than others. And that subtle teaching of the counter narrative indeed is more powerful at times than the conscious master narrative that we're taught. And I can get to that later, but this is where it is a counter narrative that we are being taught that are the focus of the microaggression source that comes on here. And going back to number 2 about not being immune, I think it would be the height of arrogance or naivety for me to say that I have somehow been immune from inheriting racial biases. And it really is important that all of us begin this process of honesty, exploring these with one another. The third thing is that it is not old-fashioned racism, sexism, and heterosexism that is most harmful to people of color. You know, when you talk about racism, we usually think about the hate mongers, the white supremacists, the Klan, the skinheads. Well, I have less concern and fear of those individuals than the ordinary, well-intentioned people that I encounter in my day-to-day activity. I mean, I wouldn't want to meet white supremacists by myself in a darkened alley or something of that nature, but that person has less ability to affect the quality and standard of my life than people who go to the voting booths and so forth. And what I would like to do is ask you this question. Are the following statistics due to old-fashioned racism or subtle, much more modern forms of racism that I call microaggressions? White Euro-American males constitute approximately 33% of the population. They occupy about 80% of tenured positions in higher education. They are 80% of the House of, well, it's varied, House of Representatives. Over the past few years, they varied between 80 to 90% of the U.S. Senate. They are 92% of Forbes, the New York Times comes out with the 100 highest paid CEOs every year. They have this. And if you look at it, you're astounded not only by how much they make, hundreds of millions a year, but by the fact that they are primarily all white men, with sprinkling of some white women that also make it in there. They are 90% of public school superintendents in an occupation that is over 90% women. They are 99, maybe more 0.9% of athletic team owners. I don't want to get into that discussion at this point. And this may give many of us, people of color, women, other marginalized groups, hope. They now are only 97.73% of US presidents. Now, unless there is something, like I say, that we don't know about Thomas Jefferson, but that's what we're seeing here. Now, the questions you should be asking is this: where are the women? Where are the people of color? Are these inequities due to old-fashioned supremacists, the Klan, or ordinary people who go to the voting booths, who educate our children and so forth? And it's a latter answer that I would stick with. The characteristics of these forms of bias are their invisibility, unintentional, and subtle nature. They usually occur outside the level of conscious awareness. This is the major difficulty, challenge that we have, to make the invisible visible. Because you cannot really get people to begin to be honest and to explore and to change if indeed their microaggressions are invisible to them. Their biases are invisible. It's not out there. Racial, gender, and sexual orientation microaggressions create psychological dilemmas for the perpetrator and the recipient because they represent a clash of racial, gender, sexual orientation realities. And you have to ask, whose reality is the real reality? When you begin to talk about, this is why microaggressions occur under a guise of institutional power. When I ask people to define power, I ask them, how do you define power? They usually say economic might, military might. My answer is that power is in a group's ability to define reality. Attorneys know this. If you can convince like in the Zimmerman trial, the Zimmerman trial was a travesty because they said race had nothing. Well, do you remember the judge in the Zimmerman trial would not allow them to use the term racial profiling? Race could not be injected. They could use the term profiling, but not race. The attorneys, both the prosecutor and the defense attorney, in their closing summation, said that race had nothing to do with this. When juror B37, was interviewed afterwards, a white woman was interviewed afterwards. She said that race never entered the jury deliberation. Now, I would say race had everything to do with it and was operating. What they mean by saying it had nothing to do with race, it had nothing to do with being African American or black. Now, when you eliminate consideration of blackness, the default standard becomes white. Do you see what I mean here? So by simply saying that we're not going to talk about Africa, people of color, you have gone to a default standard of whiteness. It's like teachers telling Latino students, I don't mind Latino students coming into my class, but I want them to leave their cultural baggage outside of the classroom. Leave it at the door before you come in. If I was to say, I don't care that you're white or about, and the teacher, as long as you keep your white, ethnic, Western European cultural baggage outside of the classroom, that everything changes then. This is why it is so important here. And the reality, the racial reality by default is one of whiteness. Whiteness is the invisible default standard that serves as an invisible veil that becomes normative in terms of the consideration. Microaggressions create a hostile and invalidating climate for marginalized groups because it saps their spiritual and psychic energies. Let me deal with this. Remember I said that people said that the microaggressions were trivial, insignificant. These are things that we were able to pull out of studies in terms of differentiating microaggressions from the everyday incivility that any of us could experience that isn't related to gender, race, ethnicity. Microaggressions are constant and continual without an end date. If someone is rude to you, it's over. It doesn't continue. But with racial microaggressions, those are experienced on a never-ending basis. Microaggressions are cumulative, and any one represents a feather that can break the camel's back. Microaggressions must be deciphered, because they contain double messages. When we did our studies with people of color, it was so depleting that one of the primary questions that they often had to deal with when a microaggression occurred was, did what I think happened really happen? Was that a purposeful, intentional slight, or that you went through? If indeed it's a microaggression, how should I respond? If I respond this way, well, who would believe me? What are the consequences if I raise this? You have that's how, energy depleting and psychologically stressful microaggressions are when they begin to occur. Microaggressions are constant reminders of a person's second-class status in society. We're reminded constantly in terms of the two that I start out with, the African-American man and the Asian-American interviewer. These are constant things that microaggressions symbolize past historic injustices. That is something, when a microaggression occurs, it is not an isolated context. It's linked. It's like telling your Jewish brothers and sisters to forget the Holocaust. You can't do that. That is a part of the experience. And this is what we find to be harmful impact of microaggressions. And then I'm going to open it up for comments or questions. Microaggressions in studies assail the mental health of recipients. It leads to anxiety, guilt, frustration, depression, low self-esteem, and so forth. Microaggressions create a hostile and invalidating campus climate. You don't fit in. And people tell you in no uncertain terms, whether they're aware of it or not, is that you don't belong here. You won't succeed here. When African American students at Columbia oftentimes tell me that they are asked, how did you make it into Columbia? There is a belief you didn't make it on your individual merit, but affirmative action, accommodated admission process, they're always suspect in terms of the credentials they have. They perpetuate stereotype threat. Claude Steele's work at Michigan, Stanford, you know what I'm talking about when I talk about stereotype threat, that it has major impact upon the learning here. They create physical health problems. Norman Anderson's group found that when microaggressions occur, there is high autonomic nervous system reactivity. And this accounts a lot of time for the poor health statistics for various groups of color. Because when microaggressions occur, you don't realize what a psychological toll it takes. I'm sure when microaggression, I wrote about this in the 2007 article, when I experienced a microaggression on a plane trip, I'll bet you if you put a blood pressure monitoring cuff on me, it would have been out of, shot into the 200 range for all the time that I flew. It has major medical, physical effects. Jack Davidio's work finds that microaggressions in the work site lower productivity and problem-solving abilities. They are responsible for creating inequities in education, employment, and healthcare. How does it do that? Well, one example I can give you was an example years ago that I experienced with one female manager in a primarily all-male management team. Had a good friend on the team that shared with her things that would happen. It was headed by the vice president, and an opening for a position for promotion came about, and he told the team he was going to promote from within that particular group. The CEO in private asked this male member of the team that he had told him that he was considering promoting John in the team. And John, he told the CEO, the vice president, he should consider Mary because Mary knows this and has, and his response was, why do I know her? Now, this is a group of 7 individuals that met monthly on a team. And when you begin to talk, ask Mary how she was treated, she would say, oftentimes when I would say something, no one would respond to it. People would cut me off. The CEO, I would give the same idea, John would give the idea next, and the CEO would say to John, that's a good idea, let's run with it. And she said, I was invisible. I wasn't there, and no wonder. So who do you think is going to get promoted? John's going to get promoted because the woman's role, Mary, was not even recognized. She was just there for other particular reasons. And I can give you other examples, but this creates the inequities that we see. And so the conclusion I make is far from being benign slights and so forth, microaggressions have maximal impact. And what I was going to do, are we hooked up to the internet? I was going to, you should go to YouTube. These are some of the, I'm working with MTV. This is one of the, I'm working with MTV in terms of they've created, because we're trying to reach the millennials and understanding what microaggressions are. I'd show you, but then there's 9 segments on this lookdifferent.org videos in which they will take you, just go plug in Look Different, and the MTV stuff will come out. You can watch the videos that they've shown on. I've never seen it because when they first asked me to join them in terms of working them, I didn't know why they were calling me. I say, well, I don't sing or dance. They said that's not what we're involved in this social public affairs thing. We're the arm of it. They're creating, they show this, and there's another, there's a program called Girl Code that will come on that really is going to deal with prejudice. It hasn't been released yet, but I've seen the initial cut of it. But go to the internet. I want you to go to this, the micro 2 reactions. You're going to come across racism, something called racism in the elevator that shows a black man and the reaction. And the other one is the interview. A black man interviews, and they show step by step all the microaggressions, all the way from a shock that this is a black candidate I'm interviewing because you didn't sound black at all over the phone. Stuff like that becomes very important. These are occurring in real life. And then this other one on cultural conditioning will give you some idea of how microaggressions occur to young girls from the moment that they're born, all the messages that they're receiving that affects who they believe they are, and that it's micro, the implicit attitude task. Do you know what that is? The IAT. This is an interview with people of the IAT. The implicit attitude task measures implicit bias versus explicit bias. The most problematic study that have come out, I find it very disturbing. Geez, I'm sorry. I find this very disturbing. It's a series of studies that was conducted by Boyson and Fogel, I believe at NYU. And what they did was that they measured the effects of multicultural training and the impact on implicit and explicit bias. I also looked at the studies that dealt with the movement of implicit and explicit bias. From about 3 years of age, differences are noticed by children. They can, but the differences are one of naivete. Though, you know, I mean, parents have embarrassment where people say, oh, look at that man with the funny eyes. Or someone rubbing their finger against a black woman to see a child, to see whether the color rubs off. You know, they notice the differences, but there's innocence and naivete about what those differences mean. Okay, both from about 3 to 5 years, 6 years of age, negative attributions to differences begins to occur. And both implicit and explicit bias tend to be at the same. From 5 to 6 up to 10 years of age, both of them move up, but explicit bias, the conscious stereotypes we have, begins to decline through adulthood. What is really problematic and disturbing is that implicit bias, your unconscious biases, do not change at all. The conscious biases are most affected. The Boyson and Vogel, when they did the, you know, we think that multicultural training in education is going to help. It does have impact in explicit bias, but the implicit biases were unaffected by the type of multicultural training that we did in higher education. So that much of what we're doing and thinking is effective is not touching the implicit bias. And that's, you know, something that we can talk about later. Let me stop there. I'm sorry. You know, I have a flight. I want to say to you that you don't think that I'm rude. I have a flight that leaves at 5:50, and the driver is supposed to meet me here at 5. So if I run out, I'm sorry. Okay. Are there questions or comments? Should I?
Moderate the discussion here because we have a large group here and we have so many people by Polycom, and we want to sort of give an opportunity, if there's an opportunity, to hear any of their questions as well. So what I'm going to do is ask you, please keep your question brief, and just for time's sake, and also kind of meet me halfway, because it's going to be kind of hard for me to run around the room and get to everyone. You have to speak your question into the microphone so the folks in Polycom can hear you. So if you have a question, please come meet me like right about here. And if there's one person ready to go, I'll hand you a microphone right now. Questions?
I have a question, but I don't need a microphone.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
They're recording it.
There's a recording, so you actually do need the microphone.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I just want to hear again the definition you gave for power.
Power is in a group's ability to define reality and imposing that upon. So when microaggression occurs, the person with the power defines whether it was or wasn't.
Let's give the campuses a chance. You may unmute your microphone if you want to ask a question. Please only have it unmuted for the question, because it does go through our sound system here in the room. Are there any questions from the campuses? Abington, Altoona, Beaver, Berks, Brandywine. All right, I'll come back to you all. You got to be quick on the draw here. We don't have a lot of time. With another question here in the room.
If we
you
want
hold
to be
just a second?
sensitive and not,
It's what?
if we want to be sensitive and not be microaggressive, and yet I feel that knowledge and familiarity is what makes people work well together. How do you ask questions? How do you learn about someone without offending them?
Okay, if you ask a question about, okay, first of all, you've got to be non-defensive and open. Usually when someone commits a microaggression, and I try to point that out to them, the first response that occurs is defensiveness. And when you get defensive, you close off. I would be more, more open to someone who was saying that, geez, that wasn't my intent. Now tell me what I did and what it means, so that there is a feeling that the person is open, receptive, and non-defensive.
Thank you. Okay, there was a question from one of the campuses. Please go ahead. All right, I'll ask one more time from the campuses. Dickinson, Du Bois, Erie, Fayette, any questions?
Can you hear New Kensington?
Yes, go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. Okay. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question. Since children will realize the differences since age 3, so as a mother, how can I teach her to deal with microaggressions?
That's an excellent question, because, prevention is better than remediation. All of us in this room are victims of a socialization process that has already cost us in terms of inheriting biases and prejudices. When you start with young children, the people most close to them and most influential are both parents and teachers. And parents and teachers really have to introduce their children or their young students to having experiences with people who differ from them in terms of race, culture, ethnicity. Intellectually reading about groups doesn't do it. There has experiential reality is the key to overcoming, I think, a lot of the biases that we have.
Right, there was someone else in the room here. Yes.
What is the best thing to do when we experience a microaggression for both sides?
This, originally when we did the study, we wanted to find out how do we educate people who experience microaggressions to educate the people who delivered microaggressions. When we started that, soon we found out that the people who were talking about microaggressions said that, I don't care about the others, I'm hurting. How can I educate someone else when I'm hurting? So our whole focus began to turn upon adaptive survival techniques that people of color, when they experience a microaggression, can use. One of them is validation from a social support group, and this occurs formally and informally. When a microaggression, I've noticed, occurs in the classroom, what happens is that students of color immediately make eye contact with one another. It's almost like, did that really happen? Yes, it happened. Because the professor or the white student who might be delivering it is not realizing. So it really is important for you to find a source of validation of the that your reality is accurate. The second thing to do is that you have to be realistic to do or not to do, and what are the consequences. And this gets to the whole issue of power imbalance. If you experience a microaggression from an employer or a professor, that person has power to determine your grades or whether you'll be promoted or not. And in some sense, you have to perhaps confront that person indirectly by finding other sources of support who can raise that with them. But there is no one way to do it. The first rule is take care of yourself. The second one is how do you raise a microaggression that would have the least consequence to you emotionally and economically.
So we have just about 2 or 3 more minutes left in order to get Dr. Sue back to the airport, although we would love to keep him forever. And I do want to offer the campuses one more opportunity. So I know there are a couple of quick questions here in the room, and I'll try to give the campuses one more opportunity.
I've got a question.
Piggyback on the, sorry.
I have a question.
Let's let campus, okay, go ahead, campus question.
Yes. Is there any indication in the research that children growing up in truly mixed neighborhoods with mixed ethnicities and races and cultures fare any better in being sensitive and less likely to commit microaggressions?
You know, I'm not aware of it. That's not been but commonsensically, I would imagine that they would be different. I mean, I've been studying baby boomers, Generation X, and millennials, and what we find is that the millennials are the most accepting about racial. They have their biases as well, but they are more accepting than Generation X, which are more accepting than baby boomers, which, you know, many of us are in. But it would be an interesting study to look at whether mixed neighborhoods that this occurs. Your question also raises another important issue, is that can people of color commit racial microaggressions against one another? And I'm not sure I would call it racial microaggressions, but we do have biases and stereotypes of one another. And that opens up a whole new area for discussion and for exploration that there's little time here to do it.
Go ahead.
So going back to the scenario you gave a few minutes ago about a classroom, you've got an instructor and a white student, say, commits a racial microaggression. You talked about what do the black students do. What does the professor do if they know, if the professor recognizes that the student has committed a microaggression? What do they do?
I think what they do is they simply apologize. I'm sorry. I really understand what I just did. Let me think about it some more. And then outside of the classroom, continue the education. The worst thing a professor does is to be silent, to ignore it, or to cut out further exploration of what might be going on. And this is related to our studies on difficult dialogues on race. When a difficult dialogue on race occurs in the classroom, the professor is most likely to table the discussion, to stop the discussion, to tell people they should respect one another, when indeed these difficult dialogues are very emotive, and you have to deal with the emotive qualities. But if you don't know what to do, I think you open up, explain what's going on, but that you will return to it next time in terms of discussing it.
Last question.
So you mentioned that the research is showing that training doesn't make a difference in our implicit biases. So if leaders are trying to change the culture of their organization, make it a more welcoming environment, what are the tools that they would use to do that?
You know, one of the things that leaders, when they're trying to do that, are operating, it's very cosmetic, I find. Well, what I mean by that is superficial and cosmetic. That's why when I first started the microaggression work, I was concerned because people kept asking me, well, what should I do on this? I could give them suggestions, but there is no positive change because their worldviews remain unchanged. And that's why I'm telling people now that microaggressions are reflections of your worldview. If you want to really begin to understand, stop microaggressions, you've really got to go through a deep soul searching on your own. And the types of training that is most beneficial, I think, are the training that would be most uncomfortable and painful for us to go through. And the problem with using that type of training is that many people will accuse you that it's unethical. Remember the Jane Elliott study on brown eyes, blue eyes, a class divided? That type of training could never occur in school systems now because of the potential legal liabilities and the potential damage and harm. That's a conflict I'm feeling now. That if I probe and make people uncomfortable, they're going to rate me in my school teaching as a racist but of a different color. I mean, that has come out. People have said that before, and that's why it's so difficult. And you know, I'm getting concerned. I've got to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your conversation today.
Thank you.
I want to remind everyone, please feel free to join us right down the hall in Senate Suites for the reception of Forum on Black Affairs and the Senior Faculty Mentor. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you from the campuses as well.